mirror what a lot of people would say here, that what you're doing is exactly what I envisioned, and a lot of people probably envision for Lake Superior region and the Western Great Lakes region and the entire Great Lakes region. And it's super exciting. And a lot of people in this room have expertise or connections to a lot of those different techniques and data. So that's very exciting for me to hear. What I'm going to talk about is my dissertation work on the North Shore of Lake Superior. And it's based on looking at habitat, and the way that I kind of, we'll say, compartmentalized the research was looking at not only stopover habitat, I might call it terrestrial habitat, but also airspace habitat. And this is a new, well, it's not new, but now the concept is starting to be recognized, and we need to start thinking about airspace as habitat, especially during movements, mass movements of flying animals, including migration birds. So why focus on the Great Lakes? And Rebecca actually showed a lot of those, like the isotopic graphs that she showed in the maps. There is a mass movement of boreal birds in the fall that runs southeast. And a lot of them are hitting Maine. A lot of those birds are also hitting the Great Lakes region. And the first major ecological barrier that they hit is Lake Superior. A map of the flagpole warbler shows the location of the Great Lakes within its fall migration trajectory. Another reason we focus on coastal areas. Currently 40% of the U.S. population lives in coastal areas. Within the next 2 decades, that may be at least half of the population, at least according to NOAA. Lake Superior coastal region on the North Shore, 93% of that area is forest, wetlands, lakes. It's a ridge and valley topography, and what I looked at was about 130 miles of the coastline, basically not going into Canada, so just Minnesota. The objective was to identify priority areas for conservation, both stopover habitat and airspace habitat. And I'm going to talk about both pretty briefly. So the hypothesis for the stopover habitat use of terrestrial habitat was that we expected to find more migratory birds using the habitat really close to shore, and also choosing different landscape types or different land cover types within vegetation, because that's what other studies have shown in coastal areas. The way that we designed this is that we had 114 trail transects that ran the entire coast of Lake Superior, of North Shore. They were all within 6 kilometers of the shoreline, so we stayed pretty close to shore in the grand scheme of things. Public trails, each of our transects was 500 meters long, and we applied a 50-meter buffer whenever the trail transects were next to each other. We did this during August, September 2009, 2010. We visited each of those trails at least 3 times during that time period. We always started at sunrise. We always walked those trails at 1 kilometer an hour to be consistent. We used a GPS unit to make sure we were walking within that pace, and recorded all the birds, actually unlimited birds, but we ended up using just birds within 50 meters of each side of the trail in our analyses. Okay, so a quick summary of what we saw in those 2 seasons. We did over 580 surveys. We recorded over 21,000 birds of 95 different species. Most common, and any of you who are trying to watch birds right now, were unidentified birds, unidentified passerines, and a lot of those birds we could identify as warblers, but 44% of the birds that we saw utilizing habitat we couldn't identify. White-throated sparrows and red-breasted nuthatches were the most common identified birds, and just from experience I would say they tend to be some of the noisiest out there. So a lot of these birds, you know, they don't have the bright plumage, they aren't making a lot of noise, they're not singing. We tend to actually see a lot of them, and they're constantly flittering around. So I'll just say what we did to differentiate between the unidentified and season is we looked at which birds we could identify, the long distance migrants and the short distance migrants, and we found that although they overlapped in season, about September 15th was kind of like the cutoff where we had mostly long distance migrants moving through before that date and mostly short distance migrants moving through after that date. So we labeled, we split at that date, and so we labeled all the birds before September 15th early season migrants and all the birds after late season migrants, knowing that there was overlap with long and short distance migrants. But you'll see in the results early and late season migrant comparisons. So for analyses, we only retained birds or bird groups where we had at least 100 individuals that were recorded. And the way that we decided to analyze data was to take our trails. So this is a Superior hiking trail. For those of you familiar with it, this is a 500 meters of trail and then 50 meters on each side of the trail. We made a polygon, so we used a lot of GIS to do this. Each of those little colored blocks is a Landcover type. And so we pulled from each polygon the average birds, like average oven birds, over the entire 2 seasons, over all the visits, and then pulled topography and Landcover variables from those polygons. And then because we use means, we can use the linear regression models because it assumes normal distribution and meets normal distribution assumptions. So, and I can answer questions about how we did more analysis in a bit. The topography variables that we used, distance from shore and elevation, and we found quadratic relationships after we started doing analysis, so we added those in. Change in slope, presence, and ridge length, those are the topography variables we looked at, and for vegetation variables, these 15 variables here, they do represent what you would find on the North Shore of Lake Superior as far as percents for land cover. A lot of aspen birch on the North Shore, a lot of northern hardwood, which in this case is mostly maples, and so on and so forth. Okay, so our results, surprisingly, we found that overall topography and land cover really didn't influence where migrants were distributed. I'm getting nodding heads. So when compared to some other coastal studies, there's less confinement to the shoreline and vegetation types. And, well, less confinement. We did find, however, a really interesting difference in topographic scales influencing different types of birds, early versus late season migrants. Let's talk about this for a sec. So first you'll see that the relationships are pretty weak. But here's the interesting thing. So when we looked at like the early season warblers, the ones that actually had a model, all of those birds that came up with the model only were associated with distance from shore and elevation. And I'm going to call those broad scale topographic cues, for lack of better words. When we looked at the short distance migrants that had models, although they were pretty weak, those were only associated with what I would call local scale topography, ridge length and slope. So there was a difference in the scale in which these birds were cueing in on, although relationships were weak. The only strong association that we had for a migrant was the Swainson's thrush. We found that, I'll explain this first. This is distance from shore. So 0 is the shoreline and moving inland, and elevation on the y-axis. All these dots represent all of our sites, and the size of that represents the mean abundance of Swainson's thrush at that site. So you can see that most of the Swainson's thrushes that we observed were at the highest elevation inland from shore. And what this doesn't show you, but I can tell you, is that the major ridge lines on the North Shore as a whole occur here and occur here, within our study area. So this was the one association that we did find. Swainson's thrushes inland at high elevations. The best land cover model that we found were for permanent residents. So, so what this told us is that if there were bird relationships with vegetation, but they just happened to be permanent residents, not the migrants. And the association here is the residents, black-capped chickadee and red-breasted nuthatches and conifer. So they're caching seeds to get ready for winter. It makes sense. Okay, so I'm going to move from stopover to airspace habitat use, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about the stopover stuff at the end. So we also looked at movements of birds through the air. This is a diurnal study. Hawk Ridge Bird Observatory, located right here, counts a lot of birds. They were set up to look at raptors moving down the shoreline because of the barrier effect of Lake Superior and other Great Lakes. So we decided that we wanted to know how birds were actually moving through the airspace, basically upstream of Hawk Ridge. And this was the first study to look at how birds were using airspace in, we'll call it a migration corridor, along the coastline of Lake Superior. And our hypothesis was that we would find spatial and temporal patterns in how these birds are moving through the air. The way that we designed this was we had 8 regions, I'll call them, from just south of Two Harbors all the way up to the Canadian border. And we set up observation sites at 3 different locations or 3 different distances from the shoreline. We tried to be perpendicular to the shoreline. It was hard because we had to find sites with a view, and we had to be creative for a couple of them. We even rented a 45-foot lift at one site so we could above the trees. Okay, so we started off with this study looking at raptors, and we started in 2008. During 2008, we realized that there were a lot of other birds moving, not just raptors. So in 2009, we added non-raptors, basically any bird that wasn't a non-raptor or was not a raptor. So during August through October 2008 to 2010, we recorded raptors moving through airspace. 2009, 2010, we recorded everything else also moving through airspace. There were 3 people on the crew, and this is, if you're familiar with the North Shore, this is Silver Bay, Teddy Gooch State Park. There was a person standing at each of these locations and observing birds moving simultaneously every hour after sunrise for 7 to 8 hours. And we were in contact with each other to make sure we didn't double count birds, and then all that data was entered into GIS. All right, so summary of the airspace. During 2008 and 2010, we recorded over 13,000 raptors. During the 2 years, 2009 to 2010, over 150,000 non-raptors and 147 different species. 90% of the birds that were recorded were passerines. These are pictures actually of our study sites. Okay, so thinking about airspace and patterns in airspace, I'm going to talk about first temporal pattern, and I'm going to look at and talk to you about time after sunrise. And then the 2 spatial patterns would be how topography influences how birds are moving through airspace and their flight heights. Okay, so time of day, this is totally what we expected. Large-bodied raptors take advantage of thermals and ridge lift. A lot of thermaling action though on the North Shore, and thermals don't develop until later on in the morning, and so large-bodied raptors don't get moving until later on in the morning, most of them, like the red-tailed hawk. And actually Rebecca talked a little bit about the morning flights. We had a pretty massive morning flight going on, and so our migratory passerines were mostly moving in during the first 2 hours after sunrise. Completely opposite of the raptors, which I guess is what we expected after seeing that the first year. So how about topography? We were interested in distance from shore, distance from Duluth, I'm going to call it just because that's the southwest terminus of that ecological barrier. Duluth being down here, and then whether or not there was a major ridge line. But the other thing that we were interested in is this so-called funneling effect. A lot of you may have heard of this, especially when we talk about raptor migration. Raptors, the diurnal raptors, a lot of times get piled up alongside along diversion lines. That diversion line could be the North Shore of Lake Superior, the coast of Maine, could be a mountain range, it could be a desert. And the idea is, if that barrier is within their migration direction, but still allows them to move, they pile up, and then move down, in this case, the diversion line of the North Shore of Lake Superior, and most of the birds then would be counted at Hawk Ridge. It's a funneling down the shore. Then we used the same type of analyses to look at the birds along the North Shore and how they use airspace. Okay.